Hello and welcome to this space for introspection, self-knowledge, and inner discovery. Today we venture with courage and curiosity into a theme that resonates in the deepest fibers of the human experience, an idea that at first glance may seem like an intriguing paradox, almost a conceptual impossibility: the genuine ability to change the past. How is this possible, you might ask? Isn't the past an immutable series of fixed events, already consolidated happenings, indelibly sealed by the relentless passage of time? It is undeniably true that the events that occurred in days, months, or years past, the exact words that were spoken, the specific actions that were taken, the circumstances that arose, are an unalterable part of history, like deep and indelible footprints in the vast sands of time. We do not possess, at least not in the literal and physical sense, a time machine that would allow us to go back and alter those factual events, nor to erase the direct consequences that derived from them. However, and this is the pulsating core of our exploration today, what we do possess, and it is an immense, transformative, and often regrettably underestimated power, is the intrinsic capacity to radically transform from our present the profound and personal meaning that those past events have for us. We can alter the emotional charge they carry, that heavy backpack of feelings we sometimes drag along without being fully aware of its origin. And, as a direct consequence of this resignification and emotional release, we can substantially modify the persistent and often limiting impact that those past experiences exert on our daily present, on our perception of ourselves and the world, and on the future trajectory of our lives. The past, although factual and unalterable in its external occurrence, is by no means a dead, inert, and static entity, stored like an old photographic negative in a dusty and inaccessible archive of our mind. Quite the contrary, the past lives within us in vibrant and dynamic ways. It breathes through the complex network of our memories, which, as we will see, are much more than simple recordings. It colors, often without our noticing, our current perceptions of the world and the people around us, and it shapes in subtle but powerful ways our future decisions, our reactions, and our behavioral patterns. And it is precisely because the past lives actively within us, in the sacred and subjective space of our consciousness, that it becomes astonishingly malleable, susceptible to being consciously reinterpreted, patiently healed, and in a very real, practical, and profoundly liberating sense, changed in its essence and in its influence. In this introspective journey we embark upon together at this moment, we will dive into the depths of our psyche to explore how we can, actively and deliberately, resignify our past. We will explore the fascinating and complex nature of human memory itself, unveiling how our present emotions, our current beliefs, and our level of maturity decisively influence the way we remember and reconstruct events. We will investigate how we can become the conscious and empowered narrators of our own life story, instead of being mere passive spectators or victims of a script pre-written by circumstances. We will discover practical tools and transformative perspectives to heal the wounds of yesterday, those old scars that sometimes still ache, thereby releasing the immense amount of vital energy that is often trapped and immobilized in unresolved resentments, paralyzing guilt, or chronic sadness that prevent us from living fully. We will learn step by step to transform the narratives of victimization or limitation that we may have internalized into inspiring stories of resilience, valuable learning, and personal empowerment. And finally, we will come to understand, with a clarity born from inner experience, how a consciously resignified past not only alleviates the heavy burden of what was and can no longer be altered, but even more importantly, becomes a solid, stable, and fertile foundation upon which we can intentionally build a fuller, more vibrant, and more authentic present, and a future that is truly aligned with our deepest essence, our most heartfelt values, and our most profound and legitimate longings. This, dear friends, is a journey towards inner liberation, towards the reconquest of our personal power over the only life we have, the one that unfolds moment by moment from this precise instant forward. Are you ready to take the brush of your consciousness and begin to rewrite the impact of your yesterday, in order to design with greater freedom and wisdom a brighter and more possibility-filled tomorrow? Let's begin this transformative adventure. Part 1. The malleable nature of our memories. The past is not set in stone. To deeply understand how we can aspire to change the past in a psychological and transformative sense, it is absolutely fundamental, as an inescapable first step, to dismantle a very common and deeply rooted illusion in our culture: the persistent idea that our memory functions similarly to a high-fidelity video recorder or a computer's hard drive, objectively, literally, and precisely recording the events of our lives and storing them intact, like perfect photographs, to be faithfully retrieved and replayed at a later time. Contemporary cognitive neuroscience and psychology, through decades of rigorous research and fascinating discoveries, have shown us conclusively and repeatedly that this conception of memory is to a large extent a flawed oversimplification. Human memory, far from being a passive archive of data, is a much more dynamic, inherently reconstructive, and surprisingly to many, profoundly creative and subjective process than we usually imagine in our day-to-day lives. Every time we recall a past event, whether it's a distant childhood memory, a conversation from last week, or a significant emotional experience from years ago, we are not simply accessing a static and immutable file stored in some corner of our brain. In reality, what we are doing, often unconsciously, is actively reconstructing that memory in the context of our present. And this complex reconstruction, this reweaving of the threads of memory, is inevitably and profoundly influenced by a myriad of factors operating at the very moment of recollection: our current emotional state, whether we are happy, sad, anxious, or calm; our present beliefs, values, and worldview, which may have evolved significantly since the original event occurred; the new information, knowledge, or perspectives we have acquired since then; and even in subtle ways, our expectations, motivations, and desires for the future. Think about it carefully for a moment. Have you ever recalled a particular experience from your childhood, perhaps an event that seemed insignificant or confusing at the time, and realized, with the perspective of years, that your perception and understanding of that event have changed drastically? Perhaps something that seemed profoundly frightening, unfair, or humiliating at the time, now, when contemplated with the maturity of adulthood, with a greater understanding of human behavior, family dynamics, or social contexts, you see in a completely different light. You might even feel compassion for the people involved back then, including your younger, more vulnerable self. This does not mean at all that the original factual event has changed, that the external reality of what happened has been altered. What has changed, and in a radical and significant way, is its internal meaning, the interpretation you give it, the story you tell yourself about it, and therefore the emotional charge that memory carries for you in the present. Our current emotions act as a powerful selective filter and an interpretive tint through which we evoke and color our memories. If, in this present moment, we feel particularly sad, hopeless, or anxious, it is much more likely that our mind, in its search for internal coherence, will tend to recall more easily and vividly past events that are congruent with that negative mood. We may even come to interpret memories that were originally neutral or ambiguous in a darker or more pessimistic light, magnifying their negative aspects and minimizing or ignoring the positive ones. Similarly, if we are experiencing a state of joy, gratitude, and optimism, it is much more likely that our selective memory will bring happy memories, moments of achievement or connection to our consciousness, or that we will see past events with greater indulgence, understanding, or even a sense of humor that was not present before. This is not an intrinsic flaw in our memory, nor a sign that we are making things up. It is an intrinsic and adaptive feature of how our brain works, always seeking a certain coherence and congruence between our current internal state and our perception and interpretation of the world, both of the present reality and the evocation of the past. Our memories adapt in a way to who we are today. The key and profoundly liberating concept that we must internalize here is that the past, in terms of its psychological, emotional, and behavioral impact on our lives, is not something that simply is back there in a sealed compartment, disconnected from our present self. Quite the contrary, the past lives actively within us, in every moment. It resides in the complex and dynamic neural networks of our brain, which are constantly reconfiguring with each new experience and each new recollection. It manifests in the subtle or intense sensations stored in the cellular memory of our body, sometimes as chronic tensions, unexplained pains, or postural patterns. And crucially, it is expressed through the stories, the internal narratives that we tell ourselves over and over again about who we are, where we come from, and what we can expect from life. Stories that often have their roots in past interpretations of significant events. And it is precisely because the past resides and operates actively within us, in the sacred, personal, and subjective space of our consciousness, that it becomes astonishingly susceptible to a deep and significant internal change. We reiterate, we cannot change the external historical facts, the space-time coordinates of what happened, but we can, and this is our great power, change the way those facts resonate within us, the way we have encoded, interpreted, and stored them with a particular emotional charge and a specific and often limiting interpretation. We can change the story we tell ourselves about the facts. Let's consider, to illustrate this more clearly, a common experience of failure in the past. Perhaps it's an important academic exam that we didn't pass despite having studied, a crucial work project in which we invested a lot of hope but that didn't turn out as expected, or a significant romantic relationship that ended painfully and abruptly. At the time that event occurred, we might have interpreted it, from our emotional state and perspective at the time, as irrefutable proof of our fundamental incompetence, our lack of intrinsic worth, or even as an ominous sign that the world is an inherently hostile place and that we are not made for success or happiness. That initial interpretation, charged with intense emotions like shame, deep sadness, helpless anger, or fear of the future, solidified and became our past regarding that particular event, the truth of that experience. However, years later, with the benefit of more life experience, having perhaps overcome other significant challenges, learned new skills, and developed greater emotional and intellectual maturity, we can look back at that same event of failure and begin to reinterpret it in radically different ways. We might come to see it, for example, as a crucial and unforgettable lesson that taught us the value of humility, the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity, or the need to ask for help and support when we need it. We might recognize that, although profoundly painful at the time, that apparently negative event redirected us, in ways we could not then understand, towards a path that ultimately proved to be more suitable, authentic, or satisfying for us. We might even, with time and healing, come to feel a certain gratitude for the wisdom acquired, for the strength forged in that crucible of difficulty. The objective fact of the failure, the exam not passed, the project not successful, the relationship ended, has not changed at all, but its internal meaning, the story we tell ourselves about it, and the impact it has on our current identity and self-esteem have been radically transformed. The memory is no longer a constant source of self-critical and limiting pain, but perhaps one of strength, learning, or compassionate understanding. This astonishing malleability of our memory, this ability to rewrite the meaning of our past, is not a weakness or a flaw in our cognitive system. On the contrary, it is an extraordinary opportunity, a gift of evolution that allows us to adapt, learn, and grow throughout our entire lives. It offers us the real and tangible possibility of not being perpetual prisoners of the interpretations we made in the past, interpretations that were often forged from a place of lesser emotional maturity, with fewer internal resources available, or with a limited and incomplete understanding of the circumstances and the people involved. It invites us bravely and creatively to become the diligent and compassionate archaeologists of our own personal history, to dig carefully into the layers of our memories, not to get stuck and endlessly relive the pain of the ruins, but to rescue the hidden treasures of learning and wisdom, to gently clean the accumulated dust from old wounds and allow them to heal, and to reconstruct with the noble and resilient materials of our present, a past that serves as a solid and nourishing foundation instead of being a heavy anchor that prevents us from navigating towards new horizons. To deeply understand that the past is not immutably written in stone but is a living and dynamic canvas upon which we can continue to paint, adding new nuances and perspectives with the vibrant colors of our current consciousness, is the first truly liberating step towards its conscious and empowering transformation. Part 2. The Power of Conscious Reinterpretation. New eyes for old stories. Once we have deeply internalized the idea that our memories, and therefore the fabric of our inner past, are inherently malleable, dynamic, and not fixed, immutable entities, a fascinating and profoundly liberating door swings wide open for us, the door of conscious reinterpretation. This is not a passive process, but an active, deliberate, and creative act by which we can consciously choose to look at our past experiences, especially those that have been painful or problematic, from new and multiple perspectives, with a broader, more nuanced understanding, and very often with a significantly greater dose of compassion, both for ourselves in our younger, more vulnerable versions, and for the other people who were involved in those events. It is crucial to emphasize that conscious reinterpretation is absolutely not about denying the reality of what happened, nor about minimizing the pain we may have felt, and much less about inventing a false or sugar-coated story to deceive ourselves. it is rather an honest and courageous effort to find deeper, more constructive, more integrative, and ultimately more empowering meanings in the events that have already taken place and that are an inescapable part of our biography. The first step in this complex but rewarding process of reinterpretation is often the most challenging and the one that requires the most courage. It is about openly and honestly questioning our automatic and habitual narratives about the past. All of us without exception have certain stories, certain internal scripts that we have told ourselves over and over again, over many years, about significant events in our lives, especially those that were particularly painful, traumatic, or difficult to process. These stories, over time and with constant repetition, can become so familiar, so deeply ingrained in our psyche, that we come to accept them as absolute and unquestionable truths, without even for a moment considering that there might be other equally valid or even more useful and healing ways of seeing and understanding those same events. Phrases like "I've always been unlucky in love" and "I'm destined to be alone," "I've never been good at studies," "I'm just not smart," "My parents ruined my childhood and that's why I'm like this," "That mistake I made in the past cost me everything and I'll never be able to recover," "I'm an anxious person by nature and there's nothing I can do about it." These are examples of narratives that, although they may contain a small grain of factual truth regarding the objective difficulties of the experiences lived, are often deeply tinged by intense and unprocessed emotions from the past, by limited and egocentric perspectives from the time they were formed, especially if it was in childhood or adolescence, and by a natural human tendency towards excessive generalization, catastrophizing, or undue personalization. Conscious reinterpretation, therefore, begins with the courage to place these deeply ingrained and often painful stories under the incisive yet compassionate microscope of our current attention and awareness. It involves daring to ask ourselves, is this the only possible and absolutely true way to understand what happened? Are there other angles, other perspectives, other factors that I haven't considered or have minimized? What underlying assumptions am I making about myself, about others, or about the world that might not be entirely true or could be questioned? What parts of the story am I omitting or exaggerating? Once we have cultivated this mental openness and have opened the door to the possibility of other interpretations, we can begin to apply various specific techniques or approaches for the active resignification of our past. 1. Actively seeking the learned lessons and hidden wisdom. Even the most painful, challenging, or seemingly negative experiences of our lives often contain, if we are willing to look for them with honesty and humility, valuable lessons and even a profound wisdom that can enrich us. Instead of focusing solely on the pain or injustice suffered, we can reflectively ask ourselves, what did I learn from this particular situation about myself, my strengths, my weaknesses, my reaction patterns, my deepest needs? What did I learn about the nature of human relationships, about the complexity of others' behavior, about the dynamics of the world in general? What skills, capacities, or inner strengths did I have to develop or discover in myself in order to overcome or navigate that experience? How did this experience, even if indirectly or subtly, prepare me to face future challenges with greater wisdom or resilience? Sometimes an apparent failure teaches us much more about the importance of resilience, humility, adaptability, or the need for more adequate preparation than many easy and superficial successes. A relationship that ended in pain can, with time and reflection, teach us invaluable lessons about our own attachment patterns, our unexpressed emotional needs, the importance of assertive and honest communication, or the value of setting healthy boundaries. Seeing the past as a school of life and its various events as personalized lessons allows us to extract the practical and transformative wisdom instead of getting stuck in bitterness, resentment, or self-pity. 2. Finding and honoring the aspects of strength, courage, or resilience that emerge during or after the difficulty. Often when we go through significant difficulties, when we face trials that seem to exceed our capacities, we discover in ourselves an inner strength, a courage, or a capacity for resilience that we did not know we possessed, or that we had greatly underestimated. It is crucial, in the process of reinterpretation, to look back and recognize not only the pain and difficulty of the experience, but also, and with equal or greater emphasis, how we coped with it, how we found a way to persevere, how, despite everything, we managed to move forward, perhaps even with a new wisdom or a deeper compassion. Perhaps we discovered an unexpected patience in the face of adversity, a surprising ability to adapt to changing circumstances, a deep connection with our inner or spiritual resources, or an ability to find small moments of beauty or gratitude even in the midst of darkness. Identifying, recognizing, and actively honoring this inherent resilience not only radically changes the narrative of the past event, moving from "I was not just a passive victim of circumstances, I was also an active survivor who fought and learned," to "this experience brought to light a strength I did not know I had," but also significantly strengthens our confidence in our ability to face present and future challenges with greater fortitude and realistic optimism. 3. Trying to see events from the perspective of other people involved, when this is appropriate, safe, and useful for our healing. This is a delicate and not always applicable step, especially in cases of abuse or severe trauma, where the priority is the safety and well-being of the affected person. However, in many other situations, trying to understand, even partially, the motivations, limitations, pressures, or even the unrecognized suffering of the other people who were involved in a past event can help us release a significant part of the emotional burden we carry, especially anger, rancor, or chronic resentment. Perhaps the person who hurt us was acting from their own unprocessed pain, their own ignorance, their own character limitations, or their own difficult circumstances. This empathetic understanding does not by any means justify harmful behaviors or absolve those who hurt us of responsibility. It means rather recognizing the complexity of the human condition and the interconnection of our sufferings. This broadening of perspective can lead to a form of compassion that, although it does not erase the harm, does allow us to release the emotional knot that energetically binds us to that person and that past event, freeing us to move on. This requires great emotional maturity and is often a step we can only take long after the initial wound has begun to heal. 4. Considering the broader context in which the events occurred. Sometimes we get stuck in the micro-narrative of a painful event, seeing it in an isolated and personal way, without considering the broader, systemic or historical context in which it occurred. We can ask ourselves what were the prevailing social, cultural, economic, or family circumstances at that specific time. What systemic pressures, expectations, or limitations existed that might have significantly influenced the events or the reactions of the people involved. How does this particular event, which at the time seemed so defining or catastrophic, fit into the totality of my life trajectory, into the broader arc of my personal development? Sometimes, by broadening the perspective and contextualizing the experience, an event that seemed like an isolated, personal, and meaningless tragedy can begin to be seen as a piece, perhaps painful but significant, of a much larger and more complex puzzle. It might even be revealed over time as a necessary turning point, a catalyst for a later development that would not have been possible otherwise. The fundamental role of emotional maturity and wisdom acquired through the passage of time and life experience is absolutely crucial in this delicate but powerful process of conscious reinterpretation. What we could not understand, process, or integrate properly at the age of 15, when our brain was still developing and our emotional resources were limited, we can see with much greater clarity, objectivity, and compassion at the age of 40 or 50, after having lived more, learned more, and perhaps worked on our own personal growth. The emotional, cognitive, and spiritual tools at our disposal change and expand as we live, learn, reflect, and grow. That is why the act of visiting our past, not to get stuck living in it, but to review it with the consciousness and wisdom of our present self, is an act of great transformative power. We are not going back to the past to relive it with the same helplessness, confusion, or pain of then, but we are bringing the bright and healing light of our current wisdom to those old dark rooms of our history, illuminating corners that we could not see before. A powerful and frequent example of reinterpretation can be the experience of having had a difficult or even traumatic childhood. Someone who grew up in a family environment characterized by emotional neglect, constant conflict, or abuse might have deeply internalized the narrative of being unloved, defective, guilty, or inherently bad. This narrative, formed in the vulnerability of childhood, may have shaped their self-esteem, their relationships, and their life choices for many years. However, later in time, perhaps through a process of therapy, deep personal introspection, the study and learning about developmental psychology, trauma, and dysfunctional family dynamics, that same person could begin to reinterpret their childhood in a radically different way. They might come to understand, for example, that the difficulties and pain they faced were not at all a reflection of their intrinsic personal worth or some fundamental deficiency in their being, but rather the direct result of the own limitations, unresolved traumas, mental illnesses, or difficult socioeconomic circumstances of their caregivers. They might recognize, perhaps for the first time, the incredible resilience, creativity, and strength they had to develop to survive and adapt in that adverse environment. They might identify valuable skills, such as early independence, a deep empathy for the suffering of others, or a great capacity for introspection, which they may have forged precisely as a result of those early experiences. The story then changes, fundamentally, from "I was a helpless victim of a terrible childhood that has scarred me forever" to something like "I went through an extremely challenging and painful childhood that, although it left me with scars, also taught me invaluable lessons about survival, resilience, and human nature, and that, in complex ways, has contributed to forging the strong, conscious, and compassionate person I am today." The objective facts of the childhood do not change. The neglect or abuse are still unacceptable, but the meaning that that childhood has for the person, the impact it has on their current identity, and the way it informs their future are completely transformed. Conscious reinterpretation, it is important to emphasize once again, is not an exercise in optimistic self-deception, nor a way of sugarcoating or denying the reality of the pain suffered. It is, on the contrary, an act of profound intellectual and emotional honesty and a powerful claim of our inherent agency over the meaning of our own lives and experiences. It is recognizing that, although we cannot always choose what happens to us in the great theater of the world, we always, absolutely always, can ultimately choose what we do with what happens to us, how we integrate it into the narrative of our lives, and what kind of person we decide to be and become from it. It is a continuous process, an art that is refined with constant practice and self-compassion, but that offers us the invaluable promise of unleashing the immense creative and healing potential that resides in our intrinsic ability to give meaning and purpose to our human experience, however complex and challenging it may be. Part 3. Healing yesterday's wounds to free today, the balm of the present. The past, when it is not consciously processed, understood, and integrated, and when the emotional wounds it may have inflicted are not properly healed, rarely stays quietly confined in yesterday like a closed chapter of a book we no longer read. Rather, and with an often surprising persistence, it tends to cast long, intrusive, and sometimes dark shadows over the entirety of our present. These shadows subtly but powerfully influence our daily thoughts, persistently tinge our emotions and moods, automatically condition our behaviors and reactions, and limit, often without our full awareness, the spectrum of our choices and possibilities in our current life. It is a profound psychological truth that many of the recurring difficulties we face in our adult lives, whether they are dysfunctional relationship patterns that repeat over and over, irrational fears or phobias that paralyze us, chronic low self-esteem that sabotages our potential, persistent self-sabotaging tendencies at work or in love, and even certain physical health problems or psychosomatic ailments, can have their deepest and hidden roots in unresolved emotional wounds from the past, in early experiences of trauma, loss, neglect, or invalidation that were not adequately processed and healed at the time. Therefore, an absolutely essential and inescapable part of the process of changing the past in a transformative sense is the courageous, patient, and profoundly compassionate work of attending to and healing these wounds of yesterday in order to truly release the fullness, vitality, and spontaneity of our today. The unprocessed past can become a persistent and exhausting source of unresolved emotional burdens that we carry on our shoulders, often without realizing their exact weight or origin. Let's think, for example, of emotions like chronic sadness, that diffuse melancholy that sometimes creeps in like a gray veil over our days, and that may originate from a significant loss, the death of a loved one, the end of an important relationship, the loss of a dream or an opportunity that was not properly grieved, that was not allowed the necessary time and space for its full expression and processing. Or let's consider the anger or resentment that are kept alive, sometimes for decades, towards someone who hurt us deeply in the past and who perhaps never offered an apology, reparation, or acknowledgement of the harm caused. This unexpressed or unresolved anger can slowly poison our inner peace and our present relationships. Let's also think about the paralyzing guilt that sometimes haunts us for mistakes made in the past, for decisions we regret, for moments when we feel we did not live up to our own values or the expectations of others. a guilt that we have not managed to transform into learning, nor have we been able to forgive ourselves for. Or let's consider toxic shame, that deep and painful feeling of being intrinsically flawed, unworthy, or inadequate, which is often internalized as a result of early experiences of humiliation, destructive criticism, abuse, or emotional invalidation. These intense and persistent emotions, when they are not allowed to be felt, understood, expressed in a healthy way, and finally released, do not disappear by magic with the simple passage of time. Instead, they tend to become embedded in our nervous system, to manifest as chronic bodily tension, unexplained pains, or persistent fatigue. They seep like a subtle but constant dye into our present interactions, affecting our ability to trust, to love, and to connect authentically with others. And they act ultimately as a heavy energetic drag that prevents us from moving forward with lightness, joy, and a sense of inner freedom in our lives. It is absolutely crucial to clearly understand how these painful emotions anchored to the past directly affect our present in very concrete ways. For example, if we carry with us an unhealed wound of abandonment from our childhood, perhaps due to the physical or emotional absence of one or both parents, it is very likely that in our adult relationships, especially intimate ones, we will experience an intense and often irrational fear of intimacy and commitment, or that, conversely, we will become excessively emotionally dependent, jealous, or possessive in a desperate attempt to avoid being abandoned again. Or perhaps, unconsciously, we will sabotage promising relationships just as they are beginning to get serious, as a way of controlling the inevitable according to our wound separation. If we carry a deep and unresolved guilt for a past decision that we consider a terrible mistake, we may find ourselves, without being aware of it, subtly punishing ourselves in the present in multiple ways, preventing ourselves from enjoying success when we achieve it, sabotaging our opportunities for happiness, or attracting situations that seem to confirm our underlying belief that we don't deserve good things. If the burning resentment towards someone who harmed us in the past is still alive and active within us, we may find ourselves projecting that anger and mistrust onto innocent people in our present, our partner, our children, our friends, or our colleagues, or we may live with a chronic bitterness that robs us of inner peace, joy, and the ability to appreciate the good that we do have in our lives. The unhealed past in this sense keeps us, in a way, as prisoners in an invisible jail, repeating over and over dysfunctional patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior, and suffering in ways that often seem disconnected or disproportionate to our current reality, but which are in fact direct echoes, painful resonances of those old unattended wounds. The complex and often non-linear process of healing these wounds from the past is multifaceted and deeply personal, and there are no magic formulas or universal solutions. However, it generally involves several key and interrelated components that we can consciously cultivate. 1. Recognition and compassionate validation. The first step, and often the most difficult and the one that requires the most courage, is to fully recognize the existence of the emotional wound and to validate, without judgment or minimization, the pain, sadness, anger, or fear associated with it. This means letting go of the avoidance, denial, or rationalization strategies that we may have used for a long time to avoid feeling. It involves allowing ourselves to feel, perhaps for the first time fully and consciously, the deep sadness that we could not cry at the time, the justified anger that we had to suppress to survive, the terrifying fear that paralyzed us, or the toxic shame that we internalized as our own. Often this honest and courageous recognition requires a great deal of self-compassion and tenderness towards ourselves, especially if we have spent a long time trying to be strong, to move on, or to get over it without actually having processed and healed the wound at its root. Validating our own painful experience is telling our inner child, yes, what happened to you was real, it was difficult, and your pain is legitimate and understandable. 2. Feeling to release, the flow of emotional energy. Emotions, as their etymology suggests, are energy in motion. They are designed to flow through us, to be felt, expressed appropriately, and then released, allowing their information to be integrated. When we repress, block, or judge them negatively, that emotional energy stagnates, becomes congested, and creates tension and imbalance in our body-mind system. Healing, therefore, necessarily involves creating a safe and containing space, whether in the stillness of personal introspection, through expressive therapeutic writing, in nature, or highly recommendably with the professional support of a compassionate and qualified therapist, or in a trusted support group, to allow those stored and often forgotten emotions to emerge to the surface of consciousness and be fully felt in the body, without critical judgment and without the imperious need to act on them impulsively or destructively, crying the tears that were not cried at the time, expressing anger in safe and contained ways like hitting a cushion or writing a letter that is not sent, trembling and releasing the fear that was trapped in the nervous system. All these are acts of profound liberation and healing. It is not about masochistically wallowing in the painful emotion, but about allowing it its natural flow, its full expression, until having completed its cycle, it can dissolve and transform. 3. Deep understanding and mature recontextualization. As we allow repressed emotions to move and be expressed, a new and deeper understanding of the past experience that originated the wound often emerges, either spontaneously or with the help of reflection. We can begin to see it from a more adult, more mature, more informed, and less egocentric perspective. We may come to better understand the complex circumstances that surrounded the event, the possible motivations, limitations, or the unrecognized suffering of the other people involved, without this meaning, we insist, justifying harmful or abusive behaviors. And crucially, we can understand our own responses and reactions at that time with greater compassion, recognizing that we did the best we could with the resources, age, and level of consciousness we had then. This process of recontextualization helps us to shed the childish, simplistic, or excessively personalized interpretations that we may have made at the time and that, without our realizing it, have perpetuated our pain and our sense of being flawed or guilty. We can begin to see, for example, that the negligent or abusive behavior of a parent was not at all a reflection of our lack of worth or our intrinsic badness, but rather a tragic manifestation of their own unresolved limitations, childhood traumas, addictions, or mental illnesses. 4. Forgiveness as an act of personal liberation. Not as forgetting, justification, or necessarily reconciliation. The concept of forgiveness is, without a doubt, one of the most profound, complex, and often misunderstood in the realm of emotional healing. In the context of healing the wounds of the past, forgiving does not necessarily mean forgetting what happened, as if it were a convenient amnesia, nor does it imply condoning or justifying actions that were objectively harmful or abusive. And very importantly, it does not always imply the need or advisability of a reconciliation with the person who hurt us, especially if that person has not acknowledged their responsibility, has not changed their behavior, or if contact is still detrimental to our well-being. True forgiveness, in its purest and most liberating essence, is an act we do fundamentally for and by ourselves. It is the conscious, often difficult but profoundly empowering decision to let go of the heavy and toxic burden of chronic resentment, entrenched anger, and the persistent desire for revenge or punishment that keep us energetically tied, as with invisible chains, to the person or event from the past that caused us pain. Forgiving, in this sense, is reclaiming our own inner peace. It is cutting those chains that bind us to suffering and prevent us from moving forward. This process can include, when appropriate, forgiving others, but it also, and equally crucially and often more challengingly, involves forgiving ourselves for the mistakes we made in the past, for the times we did not know how to act better or in accordance with our values, for the harm we may have caused to others or to ourselves, or simply for the inescapable fact of being fallible and imperfect human beings in a constant process of learning. Self-forgiveness, offered with sincerity and compassion, is an incredibly healing and liberating balm for the soul. Let's consider, to illustrate this process, the example of someone who was a victim of persistent bullying during their adolescence. That traumatic experience could have left deep and lasting emotional scars, chronic insecurity, a constant fear of judgment and rejection from others, a significant difficulty in trusting people and in establishing healthy, intimate relationships. Healing that painful past would involve, as a first step, fully recognizing the pain, injustice, and real impact of what was experienced, validating their own emotions. Then they would need to allow the accumulated anger, the deep sadness for the loss of innocence or the joy of those years, and the toxic shame that were perhaps repressed at the time, in order to survive, to surface and be expressed safely. Later, with time and reflection, they might come to understand that the cruel behavior of the bullies did not at all define their intrinsic personal worth, but most likely reflected their own problems, insecurities, or lack of empathy. Finally, the complex process of forgiveness could involve the decision to let go of resentment towards those bullies, not necessarily for them or to exonerate them, but fundamentally to free themselves from continuing to carry the weight of that bitterness and from allowing that past to continue dictating their present. And perhaps most importantly and difficultly, they might need to forgive themselves for any persistent feeling of weakness, for not having defended themselves at the time in the way that, with adult perspective, they would have liked to, recognizing the immense vulnerability and pressures of the adolescent stage. By healing these deep wounds, this person could begin to build healthier and more equitable relationships, to develop greater confidence in themselves and their worth, and to live with a greater sense of freedom and authenticity in the present. The fundamental and hopeful idea underlying this whole process is that healing the past is an act of profound and radical self-love that we courageously undertake in the present. It is by no means a futile attempt to erase history or to pretend that what happened did not happen. It is rather an alchemical process of transforming the accumulated poison of the past into a potent medicine for the present and the future. By allowing ourselves to feel and release the trapped emotions that weigh us down, and by consciously changing the limiting and self-critical narratives associated with our old wounds, we recover an immense amount of vital energy that was previously invested unproductively in keeping those wounds open, in repressing pain, or in constantly defending ourselves against the possibility of being hurt again. This newly released vital energy then becomes available to live more fully and with greater presence in the here and now, to create and nurture more authentic, deep and satisfying relationships, to pursue our dreams and aspirations with greater freedom and enthusiasm, and to build a future that is not constantly sabotaged or overshadowed by the unresolved ghosts of what was. Healing, in short, is not forgetting, it is remembering without it hurting so much. It is remembering with wisdom, with compassion, and above all with a profound sense of inner freedom. Part 4. Rewriting our personal story. From victims to active protagonists. Each of us, without exception, carries within us a personal story, a complex and multifaceted internal narrative that we have been weaving consciously and unconsciously over the years to make sense and coherence of our life experiences, especially those that have been particularly significant, challenging, formative, or even traumatic. This personal story, this intimate account that we tell ourselves about who we are, where we come from, and where we are going, is not simply an objective, factual, and neutral recounting of the events that have marked our existence. It is, much more fundamentally, a selective interpretation, a subjective construction that involves the choice of certain events as nodal points while omitting or minimizing others, an often intuitive attribution of causes and effects between events, and crucially, a specific assignment of roles, both for ourselves and for the other people who have participated in our life's plot. The stories we tell ourselves about our past are by no means innocuous or trivial. On the contrary, they profoundly shape our current identity, our self-image, and our self-esteem. They decisively influence our most deeply ingrained beliefs about ourselves. I am capable versus I am a failure. About others, people are fundamentally good versus you can't trust anyone. And about the world in general, life is an adventure full of opportunities versus life is a constant and hostile struggle. And as a direct consequence of all this, these internal narratives condition our expectations about the future and our habitual patterns of behavior in the present. Therefore, if we truly want to change the past in terms of its continuous and often limiting impact on us, it is absolutely essential and profoundly empowering to critically examine these internalized narratives and, where necessary and possible, to undertake the courageous and creative task of rewriting them from a position of greater awareness, wisdom, self-compassion, and personal power. Often, without being fully aware of it, we can remain trapped for years, even decades, in limiting or victimizing narratives that originated and crystallized in particularly painful or difficult past experiences. A victim narrative, for example, is one in which we perceive ourselves fundamentally and persistently as passive, helpless, and powerless beings in the face of external circumstances or the harmful actions of others. Internal phrases like, "They ruined my life with what they did," "Bad things always happen to me," "I must be cursed," "I can't get over the trauma of what they did to me," "I'm scarred for life," "I'm unhappy and distrustful because of my past and my family." These stories, although they may undoubtedly contain elements of factual truth regarding the harshness or injustice of the experiences lived, if they become the primary and almost exclusive lens through which we interpret our entire lives, they strip us of our personal agency, our ability to respond, and our responsibility in the co-creation of our reality. They keep us anchored in chronic resentment, paralyzing self-pity, or the fruitless search for external culprits, and prevent us from clearly seeing the real possibilities for growth, healing, and change that, despite everything, exist in the present. Other equally pernicious limiting narratives can include deeply ingrained beliefs such as, "I'm not good enough or smart enough to achieve my goals," "I don't deserve happiness, love, or success," "True love always ends in pain and disappointment, so it's better not to risk it," "It's too late to change," "I'm already too old or too damaged." These beliefs, born from past interpretations, over time become self-fulfilling prophecies, as we act in ways that unconsciously seek to confirm these truths about ourselves and the world, thus tragically perpetuating the painful patterns of the past in a seemingly endless cycle. The truly transformative and liberating power lies in the deep and experiential recognition that, although we cannot change the raw facts of the past, we do have the immense power to choose, here and now, the narrative that we build and tell ourselves around those facts. We have the ability to move from being the passive characters, the resigned victims, or the mere spectators of our own story, to becoming the active, conscious, and courageous protagonists, the heroes or heroines of our own unique life journey. This does not by any means imply denying the pain, difficulty, or injustice of what was lived. It is not about sugarcoating reality or falling into a naive optimism. It is rather about fundamentally shifting the focus of our attention from the felt helplessness and the harm suffered in the past towards the resilience demonstrated in surviving and moving forward, towards the invaluable lessons learned in the crucible of difficulty, towards the inner strengths that were forged or discovered precisely because of those difficulties, and towards the personal and spiritual growth that paradoxically is often only possible through a conscious encounter with adversity. Let's consider, to illustrate this process, the example of a person who experienced a deeply painful betrayal in an important relationship, whether it was a partner, a friend, or a family member. The initial narrative, forged in the acute pain of the wound, could be that of a victim. "They betrayed me in the worst way and broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Therefore I can no longer trust anyone, and love is intrinsically dangerous and painful." This story, if maintained without question and deeply internalized, would likely lead to a pattern of avoiding emotional intimacy, chronic distrust of others, a defensive attitude in new relationships, and ultimately profound loneliness and isolation. However, with courageous work of introspection, emotional healing, and conscious resignification, this same person could gradually begin to rewrite their story. They could acknowledge and honor the immense pain of the betrayal, yes, allowing themselves to feel it fully without minimizing it. But they could also begin to focus on how, despite that pain, they managed to survive that devastating experience, what they learned about early warning signs in interpersonal relationships, what they discovered about their own need to establish clearer and healthier boundaries, or how that experience, although terribly difficult at the time, ultimately led them to cultivate more authentic, more conscious relationships based on greater self-knowledge and self-respect. The new, more empowering and nuanced narrative might sound something like, "I experienced a very painful betrayal in the past that hurt me deeply, but it also taught me invaluable lessons about the nature of trust, the importance of personal boundaries, and above all about my own unsuspected inner strength. Although it was a difficult and long process, that experience helped me to grow, to mature, and to be much more selective, conscious, and wise in my future relationships. Today, thanks in part to that hard lesson, I choose to open myself to love and connection with greater awareness, discernment, and authenticity." The objective facts of the original betrayal have not changed. They remain part of their biography. But the person's role in the story, from passive victim to resilient learner, the meaning attributed to the experience, and fundamentally, the impact it has on their present and future, have been radically transformed. Consciously and empoweringly rewriting our personal story generally involves several interconnected steps or stages. 1. Clearly identifying the dominant and often unconscious narratives. First, and this requires radical honesty with oneself, we need to become aware of the recurring stories we have been telling ourselves about our past and about ourselves. What are the most frequent and emotionally charged headlines of our past? What roles do we habitually assign to ourselves: victim, savior, failure, unworthy, and to others, perpetrator, abandoner, critic, in these stories? Are these narratives predominantly empowering, pushing us forward, or are they rather limiting, keeping us stuck in the past? Often the simple act of writing our personal story or telling it in detail to a therapist, a coach, or a trusted and non-judgmental friend can help bring these internalized narratives to the light of consciousness. 2. Questioning, challenging, and deconstructing the limiting narratives. Once we have identified these dominant stories, especially those that limit us or cause us suffering, we can begin to question their absolute validity and their current usefulness. Is this the only possible and objective way to see things? What concrete and observable evidence contradicts this story or at least nuances it? What aspects of the experience am I leaving out of the narrative, perhaps because they don't fit my victim role or my belief of being inadequate? Who or what benefits, perhaps my own ego in its desire to be right or to avoid responsibility, from my continuing to believe and perpetuate this particular story? This deconstruction process can be uncomfortable, but it is essential to open up space for new interpretations. 3. Actively seeking alternative, more complete, and empowering interpretations. This is the creative heart of the rewriting process. It is about actively seeking, with an open and curious mind, the elements of resilience, significant learning, personal growth, demonstrated strength, developed compassion towards oneself and others, or even moments of unexpected gratitude or beauty that may be present in the past experience, although they may have been hidden, minimized, or overshadowed by the pain and the original negative narrative. It is not about inventing facts that did not happen or falling into a toxic positivity that denies the difficulty. It is about refocusing our attention, about illuminating with the flashlight of our current consciousness those aspects of the experience that were previously in the shadows but are also part of the complete truth. What internal resources did I mobilize? What support did I receive? What perspectives did I gain? 4. Explicitly incorporating the current self with its maturity and wisdom into the reinterpretation of the past narrative. It is absolutely crucial to remember and recognize that the person who is rewriting the story today is not the same person with the same level of emotional, cognitive, and spiritual development who lived the original event in the past. We bring to this process of reinterpretation our current maturity, our wisdom accumulated through other experiences, our internal resources that we have developed over time, and perhaps even the benefit of therapy or personal work done. This allows us to look at the past, even the actions of our younger self, with a greater dose of compassion, understanding, and perspective, instead of judging ourselves with the harshness with which we might have judged ourselves back then, or with which we would judge a stranger. 5. Practicing and embodying the new narrative. Rewriting a personal story is not simply an intellectual event or a writing exercise that is done once. It is a continuous and dynamic process of internalization and embodiment. It involves consciously repeating to ourselves the new, more complete and empowering narrative until it begins to feel more true and familiar than the old one. It involves starting to act in the present from this new narrative, making decisions and behaving in ways that are consistent with our identity as a resilient survivor, a wise learner, instead of continuing to act from the old identity of a victim or a failure. And it requires allowing with patience and self-compassion this new story to gradually replace the old one in our fundamental belief system, in our self-image, and in the way we present ourselves to and relate with the world. It is fundamental to understand, once again, that this process of rewriting our personal story does not in any way seek to trivialize genuine pain, justify abuse, or blame victims for their suffering. There are experiences in life that are objectively and undeniably traumatic, unjust, and profoundly harmful. However, even in the most terrible and seemingly desperate circumstances, as inspiring figures like Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and the creator of logotherapy, have taught us, there often exists a space, however small and infinitesimal it may seem, to choose how we respond internally to what happens to us, and what meaning ultimately we decide to give to our experience. Frankl reminded us that, even in the total absence of all external freedom, human beings retain the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude and one's inner stance in any given set of circumstances, the freedom to find meaning even in suffering. By becoming the conscious, courageous, and creative authors of our own personal story, we reclaim our responsibility in the most profound and empowering sense of the word, our ability to responsibility to life. We cease to be mere passive products or helpless victims of our past to become the active and deliberate architects of our present and our future, using the valuable lessons learned and the unwavering strength drawn from that same now resignified past as the solid and fertile foundations upon which we can build a more meaningful, more authentic, and more aligned life with our highest potential and our deepest longings. This conscious rewriting is, in itself, an act of profound creative liberation and radical self-empowerment. Part 5: The Resignified Past as a Foundation for a Conscious Future. The complex and often arduous process of changing the past through a deep understanding of the malleable nature of our memories, the courageous conscious reinterpretation of our life experiences, the patient and compassionate healing of our emotional wounds, and the creative rewriting of our limiting personal narratives, is by no means a mere abstract intellectual exercise or a sophisticated form of therapeutic self-deception to make ourselves feel better momentarily. It is, quite the contrary, a profound and fundamental internal transformation that has direct, tangible, measurable, and deeply liberating consequences on the way we live and experience our daily present, and on the vast array of possibilities that open up before us for our future. A past that has been consciously resignified, that has been carefully stripped of its toxic burdens of guilt, shame, or resentment, and that has been laboriously transformed into a genuine source of wisdom, strength, and compassion, ceases to be a heavy anchor that relentlessly drags us down towards the repetition of old patterns and sufferings. Instead, it becomes a solid, stable, and surprisingly fertile foundation upon which we can begin to build, with intention and hope, a more conscious, fuller, more vibrant, and above all, more authentically aligned life with our true self and our highest potential. When we succeed, through persistent and honest inner work, in transforming the meaning and emotional charge of our past, one of the first and most noticeable consequences we usually experience is a significantly greater sense of freedom in the present. Those invisible chains, forged with the metal of old fears, unresolved traumas, and limiting beliefs that kept us tied to dysfunctional patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior, begin to loosen, to lose their constrictive power, and eventually, with continued practice, to break completely. For example, if we have worked on and healed a deep wound of rejection or abandonment originating in our childhood, we will progressively feel freer and more secure to express our authenticity in our present relationships, to show ourselves as we are, without the constant and paralyzing fear of not being accepted, of being judged, or of being abandoned again. If we have managed to resignify a past experience of failure, seeing it not as definitive proof of our fundamental incompetence, but as a valuable opportunity for learning and growth, we will feel much freer and more motivated to undertake new challenging projects, to take calculated risks in pursuit of our dreams, and to pursue our goals with renewed confidence, without the crushing weight of the fear of failing again. This recovered freedom manifests in our daily lives as a palpable inner lightness, a recovered spontaneity and joy of living, and a greater ability to respond to present situations and people as they really are, in the here and now, instead of automatically reacting to them through the distorted and often painful filter of unresolved old wounds and conditioned patterns. Another direct and profoundly healing consequence of this process is a significant and perceptible increase in our inner peace. It is a psychological fact that a large part of the mental agitation and emotional turmoil we experience in our day-to-day lives, the diffuse anxiety that accompanies us like a shadow, the constant worry about the future, the disproportionate irritability at small frustrations, the recurring sadness that seems to have no clear current cause, has its deepest roots in an unprocessed past, in painful experiences that have not been properly digested and integrated. The constant mental rumination about what was or what could have been and was not, the entrenched resentment towards people or situations from the past, the unforgiven guilt that corrodes us from within, all of this consumes an enormous amount of our precious psychic energy and keeps us in a state of chronic internal tension, of constant alert, which prevents us from relaxing and enjoying the present. By healing and resignifying the past, by letting go of those emotional burdens and deactivating many of these internal triggers that kept us in a cycle of reactivity, our mind naturally becomes calmer, clearer, more spacious. Our emotions, although they continue to arise in response to life, become more balanced, less intense in their negativity, and easier to navigate, As a result, we find a greater ability to genuinely enjoy the present moment, to appreciate the small joys and beauties of daily life that previously went unnoticed, and to cultivate a state of inner serenity that does not depend, fragilely and precariously, on all external circumstances being perfect or pleasant. Furthermore, a past that has been transformed and from which we have extracted wisdom endows us with a greater capacity to make more conscious, wiser, and more aligned decisions in the present. When we are no longer operating predominantly from the autopilot of conditioned fear, internalized guilt, or uncritically inherited limiting beliefs from the past, our choices in the present become much clearer, more intentional, and more coherent with our current deepest values and our most authentic future aspirations. We can discern with greater ease and speed which opportunities, relationships, or paths are truly nourishing and expansive for us, and which are simply subtle or obvious repetitions of old dysfunctional patterns that no longer serve us. Our decisions then cease to be largely automatic, predictable, and conditioned reactions by the wounds and limiting learnings of the past, to become creative, flexible, deliberate, and empowered responses to the unique demands and opportunities of the present moment, clearly oriented towards the future we consciously wish to build for ourselves and perhaps for others. Crucially, and most hopefully, a past that has been resignified and from which we have drawn its lessons and its strength, opens up new and often surprising and expansive possibilities for our future. When we are trapped in a persistent narrative of victimization, failure, or limitation based on past experiences, our horizon of future possibilities shrinks drastically, as if we were looking at the world through a narrow and dark tunnel. We believe, often unconsciously but very powerfully, that certain things are simply not for us, that we are intrinsically incapable of achieving certain goals or experiencing certain states of well-being, or that we are irremediably doomed to repeat the same mistakes and sufferings over and over again, as in a tragic script from which we cannot escape. However, when we manage to transform that limiting narrative through the work of healing and resignification, and when we begin to recognize and embody our inherent strength, our proven resilience, and our immense capacity for learning and growth, the future unfolds before us with a much broader, richer, and more vibrant array of options and potentials. We then dare to dream bigger, to set more ambitious and meaningful goals, to explore new paths and territories that previously seemed forbidden or too intimidating. The past, instead of being an invisible glass ceiling that limits our growth and aspirations, becomes a solid launchpad, a springboard that propels us forward with greater wisdom, discernment, and a self-confidence that is born from integrated experience. The fundamental and profoundly liberating idea underlying this whole exploration is that the past, when worked on consciously and with compassion, ceases to be a heavy burden that we painfully drag day after day, or an invisible prison whose bars are forged with our own fears and limiting beliefs. Instead, through an inner alchemical process, it is transmuted and becomes an inexhaustible source of practical wisdom, emotional strength, and deep and genuine compassion. The hard-won lessons from past difficulties become reliable guides and luminous beacons for our present and future decisions. The resilience that was forged in the crucible of adversity gives us the confidence and fortitude to face new challenges with a different perspective. The compassion that was born from our own healed or healing wounds allows us to connect more deeply with the suffering of others and impels us to contribute more significantly and authentically to the well-being of the world around us. Our past, with all its lights and shadows, its joys and its sorrows, is harmoniously integrated as a valuable and inseparable part of who we are today, but crucially, it no longer rigidly defines us nor limits us in the same oppressive way. Ultimately, by embarking on the courageous process of changing the past in the profound sense we have explored throughout this conversation, we are actively participating, whether we are fully aware of it or not, in a sacred process of continuous creation of ourselves and of the narrative of our lives. We are recognizing, with humility but also with immense power, that although we cannot go back in time to rewrite the history of external events, we can, and in fact we do constantly, rewrite the history of their impact on us, the history of their meaning on the canvas of our consciousness. And in doing so, we are not only healing the wounds of yesterday, alleviating the unnecessary suffering we have carried for so long, but we are, even more importantly, actively and intentionally sowing the seeds for a more vibrant, more conscious, and more joyful present, and for a more hopeful, freer, and more possibility-filled future. It is an eloquent testimony to the incredible and often unsuspected power of human consciousness to transform subjective experience, to find freedom and meaning even in the most difficult and seemingly desolate circumstances, and to co-create a reality more aligned with our deepest longings. The resignified past thus becomes not a ballast, but the powerful wind beneath our wings, propelling us with grace and wisdom towards the fullest, most authentic and most luminous version of who we are truly destined to be. Conclusion: the liberating power of being the authors of our story. We have reached the end of this profound and, I hope, enlightening exploration of the surprising and often radically underestimated capacity that each and every one of us possesses to change the past. Throughout this extensive introspective journey, we have carefully unraveled the fundamental idea that while the concrete historical facts that make up our biography are, in their materiality, unalterable and immutable, the deep and personal meaning we attribute to them, the persistent emotional charge they carry in our nervous system and psyche, and fundamentally, the active power they exert over our present life and the trajectory of our future, are profoundly malleable, dynamic, and eminently susceptible to a conscious, deliberate, and profoundly liberating transformation. We have seen in detail how human memory is not, as is often believed, a fixed and objective recording of events, but a complex and continuous reconstruction that is inevitably influenced and colored by our current perspective, our emotions, and our wisdom. We have explored how the courageous, active reinterpretation of our past experiences, especially the painful or traumatic ones, can unveil crucial lessons and inner strength that previously remained hidden under layers of suffering. We have understood how the patient and compassionate healing of the emotional wounds of yesterday, those scars that sometimes still ache and limit us, frees us to live with greater fullness, spontaneity, and joy in the only time we truly possess, the today. And we have discovered how, by taking the reins and consciously rewriting the limiting narratives of our personal story, we can move from feeling like passive victims of circumstances to becoming the active, conscious, and empowered protagonists of our own unique destiny. The central idea, the guiding thread that we have carefully woven throughout this conversation, is that we are by no means condemned to be perpetual and helpless prisoners of our past, no matter how painful, difficult, or even traumatic it may have been. On the contrary, we possess an inherent agency, an inner creative power, a spark of consciousness that allows us, if we so choose and commit to the process, to resignify our experiences, to integrate their valuable teachings, even the most arduous ones, and in this fundamental way, to transform the influence that that past has on our current identity and on the future trajectory of our lives. This process of changing the past, in its deepest essence, is an act of radical self-empowerment, of profound inner liberation. It is a courageous and conscious claim of our inalienable ability to define ourselves not so much by what happened to us in the past, which was often beyond our control, but, and much more significantly, by what we actively choose to do with it in the present, by the person we decide to become and strive to embody as a result of those very experiences. It is absolutely fundamental to remember and always keep in mind that this is a path, not a final destination one arrives at once and for all. It is a continuous, organic, and deeply personal process of self-discovery, patient healing, and evolutionary growth. Without a doubt, there will be moments of profound clarity, of significant breakthroughs, and of a liberating sense of progress. But also inevitably, there will be moments of doubt, of confusion, of apparent stagnation, or of painful re-encounter with old patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior that we thought were already overcome. The fundamental key to navigating this path successfully and with grace lies in perseverance born of a clear intention, in infinite patience with ourselves and with the inherent slowness of all processes of deep transformation, and above all, in an immense and unconditional compassion towards ourselves as we navigate the often turbulent and complex waters of our own inner history. Every small step we take, with intention and courage towards the resignification of our past, however modest or insignificant it may seem at the moment, is an invaluable victory that brings us tangibly closer to a freer, more authentic, more conscious life, full of possibilities and peace. I sincerely hope that this extensive and deep exploration has offered you not only intellectually interesting concepts or new ideas to reflect upon, but also genuine inspiration and, perhaps most importantly, some practical tools and transformative perspectives to begin or to continue with renewed energy and hope your own unique journey of personal transformation. May you feel deeply empowered to look at your past, even its darkest and most painful chapters, with new eyes full of wisdom and compassion, to heal with tenderness and patience what within you needs to be healed, to rewrite with creativity and courage the stories that no longer serve you, that limit you, or that prevent you from unfolding your full potential, and to build with intention and joy from this very moment a present and a future that authentically reflect the fullness of your being, the richness of your integrated experience, and the inherent magnificence of your human potential. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for accompanying me on this profound and significant reflection. May the wisdom that already resides in the depths of your being, and the strength you have shown by coming this far, always guide you with clarity and love in the noble and continuous art of transforming your personal story, and of creating day by day the life you truly long for and deserve to live.